All right, guys, something completely different today. I've got Sam from Liberationist Martial Artist. Sam is the Liberationist Martial Artist. So if you go on liberationmartialarts.substack.com, Southpaw Podcast, southpawpod.com, and on Twitter, it's Liberationist MA, the MA being for martial arts. And Sam is here with me, and we're gonna have just a conversation mostly about like pedagogy, teaching, and martial arts, and politics too, because we can't avoid it, and we
hmm
we don't. How are you doing, Sam, tonight?
I'm good. Hello, world. I don't normally do
Video.
video. As you know, like you, I record myself a lot, but it's normally just audio and just me talking and not
Yeah.
thinking about backlighting or things like that. So when things
Or
like this happen,
the
I'm like, this is like my setup is perfect for audio as far as where
yeah,
everything
yeah,
is. Even like I used
absolutely.
normally have clothes everywhere that kind of muffles the
Yeah.
echo. But for
No, even
video,
this, like I'm in a basement and people have said that my background looks like a bathroom and
yeah.
like all my books and everything are in front of me. So like the
Uh,
intellectual podcast has all the bookshelf behind you, right?
yeah, yeah,
But my
yeah.
books are in front of me where I need them to work, and it's
Yeah.
like this blank bathroom behind me. Anyway, so Sam, I wanted to talk. Let's talk about martial arts. You've developed a kind of a teaching approach to martial arts. That's the main thing I want to talk about. But I want to get some things out of the way first, some things off of my chest, you know, and like there's this question. As someone who's interested in history and someone who's interested in martial arts, like I couldn't help but look into the history of jiu-jitsu, the history of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and like there's a writer who writes about it, Roberto Pedreira. He wrote a whole series of books called Choke,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And like a lot of what we learned about, there's like a whole myth that it was invented by a single family in Brazil someone who observed the movements and then invented them themselves and all kinds of things. But when in reality, it was just like judo,
Yeah.
changes to judo gradually that happened over time. But the other
hmm
thing that like mystifies me is, how right wing, like not just right wing, but like ultra right wing, martial arts is today. Like, it's always Trump sitting in the front row of UFC. Everybody going on Rogan is like the big dream is to go on Joe Rogan's show. Um, and after every speech, it's like you'll get anything from like the Iranian American guy saying that he dedicates his usually loss and sometimes victory to the victims of Marxism. You'll get, what's that guy's name? He
Benil Dariush,
Yeah, Dariush, that's right.
who's
Uh,
like a very Christian nationalist, like
yeah.
very right wing. Yeah, he
Yeah.
himself is an interesting person to unpack because, like a lot of things in MMA, right? MMA means mixed, and his beliefs and things like
Uh,
a lot of,
eclectic.
yeah, a lot of MMA people, their politics, even though it's right wing, it's not easy to categorize either. It's
No,
not like a
well, and
country western.
it's intra
Yeah.
right wing. So like, everybody got a lot out of like Jorge Masvidal defeating Ben Askren in 5 seconds or 4 seconds or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's like Ben Askren was in the lead up to the fight, like kind of being racist towards Masvidal. He was calling him George when he knows his name's
Yeah.
Jorge.
Yeah.
And, he would call Kamaru Usman Marty instead of calling him Kamaru. And like he thought that was like really cute. So that's like one way to be right wing. And Jorge obviously didn't like that. But then Jorge is like, let's overthrow Cuba and I fight for, Trump and let's go Brandon. So they hate each other, sure, but like they all agree on a lot
Yeah.
of like basically fascist politics. And so
Yeah.
there's this funny thing I saw a little while ago because I've also like had to leave gyms and stuff because of fascism. It just got a little, it's not so much that like I couldn't take the fascism anymore, but like more like they realized that I'm not a fascist, and so it became impossible to keep training there. Uh, but I just wanted to share this with you because I had just left a BJJ gym because of the fascism, and then I saw this quote, and it was like the algorithm was taunting me or something. But it's Bernardo Faria who, if people watch videos or purchase video instructionals from BJJ fanatics or judo fanatics or wrestling fanatics or whatever, that whole ecosystem is Bernardo Faria. And Bernardo Faria, I don't know anything about his politics. He seems like a pretty, what's the word? Like pretty chill and pleasant guy who's very nice to everybody and friendly to everybody. I have never heard him say anything political. And here he says, today I was reflecting on how amazing jiu-jitsu is. With the upcoming election here in the USA and the world feeling so divided, there's one place where none of that matters, the mat. It's a space where political beliefs fade away and we all come together. How amazing is that? I wish more people around the world had the opportunity to share the mats like we do. But
Mhm.
meanwhile, like all the major figures in jiu-jitsu, like Gordon Ryan and John Danaher and um, you know, all of the Brazilians too are like on on the far right. Like
Including Bernardo.
oh, and Bernardo too. Well, I'm not
And the
surprised.
thing is, this quote sounds
Yeah.
nothing like him. This is not how he used to sound.
Oh,
You look
interesting.
at his post pre ChatGPT and you
Okay.
compare it to now,
Yeah.
very different. That he ran that through some kind of
Filter.
yeah. He like had an idea and
But it's
then
still good that he said it. I don't know. It still doesn't fit with like how they behave.
well
Um,
also it kind of does. It's because it's like saying like, oh,
we're all
we allow
fascists.
everybody here. So
Yeah.
if you don't feel comfortable in this gym or leave because there's people who are like anti-trans or like
Yeah.
fascists and who are
Yeah.
racist, then that's on you. We have a place where racists and people who are
Yes.
minorities can get along together. You're the problem, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes a sorting mechanism where victim blames. It's like, yeah, it's an
Hmm.
open market. It's a town square. It's like the Joe Rogan thing that he always talks about with how his platform is, right? We just let everybody on, but it's like, no, but
Yeah,
then,
you let 200 ultra right wingers on and four left wingers on, you know, in the
yeah,
past 20 years. And then it's like,
yeah.
yeah, we've got everybody.
That's such a cliche jujitsu post too, because people make that like every day. Some shit
Okay.
like that. We are all the same on the mass, blah, 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 blah. They
Sure.
always like, I guess now with ChatGPT, maybe they won't do that, but they used to always frame it like cops can train here, criminals can train here. So the opposition, that's like literally was a common
Mm,
framework that they used to use. And it's basically saying it's in opposition, right? There's the cop, and if you're
hmm.
not for the cop, then you're a criminal, obviously, right?
Obviously.
Those are the two poles.
Corrupt cops can train here.
Yeah.
Cops
Sexual
who,
predators, they're
yeah,
victims, they could
cops
all
who
train
work
here.
with organized crime can,
Yeah.
yeah. But like, I kind of like, I kind of think of martial arts as like nationalist projects. Like judo was a nationalist project, Taekwondo is a
Right.
nationalist project, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu is peculiar because it's like growing up in the night in the under the Brazilian dictatorship, really. Like
Yeah.
Helio Gracie's like a
Yeah.
friend of the Brazilian
Yeah.
dictators. And so it is a cop's martial art. And like
Yeah.
it's interesting because like the bias of jujitsu is like control, taking your time, getting the person to the ground. Like these are all things that like I think a cop would be organic to what a cop would want to accomplish if
Yeah.
you're making an arrest.
Yeah.
And if you have backup and if you have all the time in the world, as opposed to like somebody who might have to escape a situation, you wouldn't necessarily want to hold someone down,
Yeah. No, this was
or
always for cops because if you look at even jujitsu that was parallel to Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but the jiu-jitsu that was being taught
yeah,
in
Japanese jujitsu, yeah.
yeah, Japanese jiu-jitsu that was being taught in the US during like let's say the Teddy Roosevelt era. You look at all those
Hmm.
books, and a lot of them were for cops, and it shows like cop drawings on the cover. It was
Hmm.
always made for cops. And then in Brazil, the same thing. It was always made for cops. It was part of like the military. It was part of the fascist regime. And then when it came to the US, where did they go? They started opening up gyms next to military
Military
bases.
bases. Hmm.
The headquarters HQ is like Cop Town, like where all the police stations are. Wherever there's a police station, there was a jiu-jitsu gym, right? Now it's like they
Yeah,
ran out
they're
of
everywhere,
spaces.
everywhere.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's not enough. They would be self-limiting if they only opened up next to military bases and police stations. So they open it up. But anywhere there's a military base, there's a bunch of jiu-jitsu gyms. Anywhere there's a police station, there's a bunch of jiu-jitsu gyms, and that's historical.
Yeah.
So, um, you know, doing this project, Southpaw, which was kind of like a reaction to Joe Rogan and like right-wing martial arts, right? Which started in 2018. I've had a lot of interviews like this where I've explaining for the first time, like, and unpacking the right wingness of martial arts as we know it today, especially in the West, right?
Hmm.
But the thing is, like, with my new project, it's not even new. It's been around, but like, I haven't really ever talked about it on somebody else's podcast. I kind of want to flip the script because, okay, let's start from the position that a lot of people now today already understand. So we don't need to unpack that martial arts, not just MMA, just martial arts writ large and as practiced in the US. Like you look at
Hmm.
Chuck Norris to like other old
Yeah.
school people, a lot of them are chuds and have always been chuds, right?
Okay, wait. You use chud and I understand chud from the way that you use it,
Yeah.
but like it's not a common word for me.
Yeah.
The only person I know that uses it is you. So maybe you can give a succinct academic definition of chud for the
So
gratification of
chud,
my
yeah,
audience, by
chuds.
the way, apparently is like majority of them are 50 and above. So they'll probably want to know what chud is.
Well, we have a lot of crossover audience, so they might already know from me. But so Chud actually started from like an old sci-fi, I believe,
Okay.
book or novel, and it's like an acronym about like these like um monsters that lived underground,
Okay.
and then it somewhere flipped into a pejorative
Hmm.
for right wingers and
Okay.
reactionaries, right?
Okay.
People who wanted to dig into the past or whatever it was, right? So I didn't
Okay.
invent this term, but a lot of people, I guess, heard it from me because I guess like internet exists and I had a following and bigger than my following, some of my tweets that use the term chuds has gone viral.
Okay.
Um, and secondly, I think because of martial arts, there's just a lot of like um, taxonomy, right? We always categorize things, name
Yeah.
things, right?
Yeah.
Naming of things. So it's like in the martial arts world, once I started using it, it was already familiar to me to like categorize things, right?
Right. Right.
Even like martial artists, you're like, this guy's this kind of
So type.
player, this person has this kind of style.
Right.
And so Chud fit right in for me. Unconsciously, I just started using it. And then other radical martial artists and martial artists who were like socialists, um, who are because they're in the martial arts world, it became a natural fit too because they were already kind of like categorizing things in that way, right? So that's kind of how I didn't invent it, but I ended up using it more just because it fits into this pre-existing
I see.
martial arts culture that I'm from.
But you're in California.
Yeah,
So like this is my pipeline too. Like I went to a taekwondo
yeah,
I went to a taekwondo gym as a kid and then like didn't like it very much and then in high school I discovered Bruce Lee and so it was like a Bruce Lee kind of thing and then I found a place to train Jeet Kune Do for a while and I trained Jeet Kune Do and then it was like you kind of everybody kind of migrates to BJJ.
yeah,
And it's like, well, BJJ beats everything else. So BJJ
yeah,
is the best. And like
yeah,
BJJ is the only martial art that like is most proven scientifically effective. And it's like,
yeah.
it took me a really long time. I'm still training jujitsu, but like
Hmm.
it took me a really long time to like realize the smoke and mirrors of that too. Like
Hmm.
the UFC was very nicely arranged to make sure the grapplers we're far away from the hoist until the later rounds of the tournament, and they had trained against all these martial arts, and those martial arts hadn't trained against jujitsu. So there was all these things that gradually faded away, and now MMA is what it is. But like, what do you like in terms of that lineage, because I don't see the Bruce Lee kind of martial arts community, and lots of people came to it through Bruce Lee. Maybe not as much anymore. Now people probably come through UFC and watching UFC and Joe Rogan actually. But like
and movies.
the Bruce Lee sphere isn't necessarily reactionary, right? It's like kind of 70s. He's close to hippies, and there's I don't know. You might know more about this than me.
Yeah.
It's pretty
So number one,
superficial.
yeah. So number one, sorry. My 5-year-old was walking and I was trying to like
Yeah,
tell him
yeah.
like,
I've been
hey,
I've
I'm
been Zoom
busy.
bombed. I've been Zoom
Yeah,
bombed by
so
my
that's
kids.
why I had that peculiar
Yeah.
behavior for a second. As far as Bruce Lee, what I found, and I've known people like I trained with Gene LaBelle, so a lot
Mm,
of like their Gene LaBelle was a close friend of Bruce Lee, and so a lot of their mutuals would come in and so and so. So there's like a lot of projection.
mm-hmm,
I don't know Bruce Lee,
mm-hmm.
um, but this isn't about Bruce Lee, but the people around him. I don't know
Yeah.
what they were like in the past, but a lot of them are reactionaries.
Okay.
You deconstruct hippies again, right? And
Yeah,
it's like a
yeah, I
lot of them
suppose.
were counterculture, but they were like counterculture as far as they were libertarians, right?
Well, I don't know if you've heard of this book, Who Wrote the Tao? So somebody,
Oh, it talks about how Tao of Jeet Kune Do was plagiarized from a bunch of other people, or it was
yeah,
no, no,
it
written
was never, I don't
posthumously.
think it was ever, yeah, it
Ri-
was never really meant to be a book, right? Like it
Yeah,
was his notes. And
yeah,
so what it turns out that essentially every single word in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do comes from someone else.
yeah, yeah,
It's a quote. Like he was just sitting there writing quotes in his notebook. And so everything that he said that's attributed to him was actually from someone else. And
yeah.
um,
Well,
one of my
there was a
yeah.
philosophy of Bruce Lee book I think his daughter eventually released because she got ownership of the IP, and all
Okay.
his most famous quotes are not in there
Oh, I
because she
see.
had to fact check it, edit it, and
Yeah,
then like a lot of
yeah.
his quotes, like
That
one of his
makes
most
sense.
famous quotes about like that people use all the time about you using what's useful and getting
That's
rid of
from
what's not.
Mao.
Yes, they don't want
Yeah,
to quote
see?
Mao, so all that wasn't in that philosophy book that even Linda Lee or even Shannon
Shannon.
Lee was trying to
Yeah,
cash in
so
on.
Mao, that's the thing. The most the coolest quote that I always identified with in terms of like teaching, in terms of all these things, was turned out that it came from Mao Zedong, who is a
Yeah.
left-wing figure. So like I have this analogy because I've been studying military affairs for the past year, especially intensely.
Hmm.
And a lot of the best military writing is actually from left-wing
Mm.
theorists. So like
Hmm.
whether it's
Oh,
Mao, Mao is a huge one, but General Giap and an Asian Asian left-wing theorists, or General Giap from Vietnam, and even or Che Guevara, or all these kind of left-wing theorists of guerrilla war, and
hmm.
even reactionary military chuds. Um, now that I've picked up your lingo, they will reluctantly use these same theorists
Yeah.
because they have to. And so I kind of feel like in the martial arts now, we are in that position, or I am in that position, but you're going to help me get out of that position,
Hopefully.
because I am in that position where I'm like, okay, well, here we are now,
Yeah.
and the skills are in the hands of the fascists. And so we
Yeah.
have to go and learn them and then figure out back again how to make them our own, as Mao
Okay.
Zedong would say.
So let me go back to a previous thought I had about um, being on these kind of podcasts, deconstructing a lot of this, right?
Hmm.
Um, but I want to flip the script today because that's what a lot of liberation martial arts is flipping the script, which is that we're already accepting the chud
Hmm.
reactionary framework of martial arts that they existed as military arts or self-defense arts. And
Okay.
that's not true. Those were actually the outliers. So
Hmm.
today, what they've already done through Western hegemony
Hmm.
is they've erased all those other practices and they only highlight more of these modern military martial arts, and also a lot of these older ones become military arts, or their pedagogy has changed, right? These were folk
Mhm.
arts that became
Mhm.
standardized. So if you look at 10,000 different what we would classify as martial arts, because even the term martial means military, right?
Mhm.
And that's not what these arts were. If you
Mhm.
look at over 10,000 different martial arts, a lot of them don't exist anymore, right? But quote unquote, how we would frame them as martial arts, they were no different from folk dances. They wore a
Mhm.
lot of the same costumes. They almost always involved music. Why
Mhm.
music? Because they didn't military drill these techniques. It was always continuous play. Why would you have
Mhm.
music if you're just going to repeat the same movement over and over like the military? And also that
Mhm.
makes decision make it removes decision making, right? You're like a soldier,
Mhm.
not having to think about anything, not deciding, and you're just told what to do, and you just mindlessly repeat it, right?
Mhm.
Why would you need costume? Why would you need music, right? None of this makes sense, right? But if you look at all these arts from communal cultures, which might even include European cultures, most of what we would classify as quote unquote martial arts were off balancing games.
Mhm.
You just grab somebody, how you grab might be different, and you just try to off balance them.
So
That
like
was
what we
most of
think
it.
of as like Tai Chi basically or
Yeah.
sumo. Yeah.
A lot of times you didn't even have to go to the ground.
Yeah.
Why? Because these arts were practiced on the ground, right? We think
Yeah.
about like what is, and not just like indigenous cultures in North America, but a lot of
Mhm.
traditional cultures, communal cultures in the past, they had a connection to the land, right?
Mhm.
So the land was very different, right?
Mhm.
So you practiced on the land, you practiced on the dirt, you throw your friend, your neighbor to the dirt, they could get
Mhm.
cut, they could get hurt. If you continue fighting on the ground, you're going to get hurt. How are they going to help you the next
Mhm.
day, right?
Mhm.
It's a sustenance lifestyle. You need everybody. Everybody needs to
Yeah.
help. But also, you're not seeing your neighbor as the other. So this also goes back to self-defense. What
Right.
it's like going back and now projecting the reactionary Western individualist idea of the self back onto all these cultures. And we just took that as
Yeah.
basic fact, as a feature of the
And
universe, instead of that's not how it was.
like living in fear, right?
Yeah.
Like
The
anybody on the
suburban,
street might
as if
attack
they were
you.
suburbanites back then,
Yeah. And like
having
going to
fear of the urban
school,
areas.
somebody is gonna pick on you. Like
Yeah.
it's all of this assumption that like the world is this hostile place and
Yes.
you have to learn to defend yourself by
Yeah.
hurting other people. Whereas like, yeah, like what you're talking about is like these kind of structured games of goofing around with with people you care about, like siblings and cousins and
Yeah.
whatever at all ages.
And also, what do we mean by folk? That means there was like no necessarily a creator, right? So there was no
Hmm.
standardized. Folk means everybody can contribute to this thing. So it wasn't
Hmm.
formalized. It wasn't, they didn't even have these formalized movements for you to constantly repeat, right?
Hmm.
That's why different families had different moves and whatever. Now a lot of these folk arts became standardized and you have to repeat these motions, but that's not how they were practiced. It's not like one area, you also it's projecting back onto the past, today's information landscape.
Yeah.
Like one area might be practicing this and it assumes they know what this other area is doing and then they combine it and formalize it into these techniques that you must now drill, right? That's not how it existed, right? You even think about these, a lot of these grappling arts, a lot of cultures had some kind of
Hmm.
grappling arts.
Hmm.
Very few of them became what we know as like submission arts. Why?
Hmm.
It's not because they couldn't figure out after grabbing people that you could hurt them. It was
Yeah.
that they didn't like that. So you look
Yeah.
at the cultures that did like that, right? And
Hmm.
this goes back to hegemony, right? Who were the cultures that liked the colonizers, right?
Yeah.
You had Europeans, right, with catch wrestling. You had
Yeah.
American catch wrestling. A lot of folk arts did that, right? And then you had white settlers in
Hmm.
conjunction with Japanese settlers in
Yeah.
Brazil, right? Settling in, indigenous land, occupying it, and then merging
Yeah.
together, right? They oftentimes radicals make it seem like, oh, the Brazilians stole this like pure bottom up art from the Japanese. I'm like, Japanese were colonizers. What are you talking about? So,
Japanese are colonizers, and like judo culture is also very hierarchical and
yes,
very rigid and very all the things that jujitsu is because once again, it's the
yeah.
same thing. But like
But look at the pattern, is what I'm saying. Who
yeah.
liked hurting each other? It's these people who thought of
Yeah.
your
And
opponent as not your neighbor, but as the other,
yeah,
right?
and
And
in
then,
particular, it's like the submission art, like you said, it's like about making someone give up. It's about making
yes,
someone scream or
lose
tap.
face.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
yeah.
Japan, Europe, the
Hmm.
US, And it wasn't even like it's not indigenous Brazilians, right? It's
Yeah,
settlers in Brazil on a
absolutely.
colonial project. So that's the pattern, right?
Mhm.
And then that became how we understand martial arts. And then we're like, oh, so how did it become so reactionary? It's like, no, dude, it's like that's the stuff that we highlighted and then projected onto the past. But that's not how most of these things existed. They existed
Yeah,
and they
and
happened at
and
the same time as like festivals, right?
yeah,
They were practiced as games. People always say this is not a game. It's like, no, man, it used to exist
that's
as
what
a
it
game.
was again. But also, like to the extent that it's a sport, it's also like a very nationalist sport. So like
Hmm.
boxing or Muay Thai, these become like sports. And Muay Thai, like I looked into the history of Muay Thai and it was different before they incorporated Western boxing.
Hmm.
And they, like they didn't wear those gloves. They don't
Yeah.
wear that, like it was a different art and it was more dancey and musical and um yeah, so
Which they
all of
try to
these
keep, right? But it's now more ornamental.
yeah, exactly. It's ornamental to the brutality of like picking the most brutal painful moves and making something very streamlined out of that.
And we're seeing that happen again, right? It's not even
Hmm.
happening today. It's been happening for the last few decades. We saw that with the UFC,
Hmm.
where it's not even organic. Through incentives, they're
Yeah.
trying, they got people to modify their movement repertoire to be the most uh, conducive to knockouts,
Yes,
right?
yes, the rule set
Not
and the
even the explicit
market.
rule set, but
Yeah.
like the incentive structure of the bonuses.
Yes, the
And also
bonuses.
Dana
Yeah.
White yelling at you if you won, but won the wrong way, right?
Yeah.
And then you
Yeah.
have the same thing happening with Chatri, who's changing Muay Thai,
Hmm.
where he's also like changing the movement repertoire, right? It's like basically when you change the movement repertoire, you're policing bodies, you're policing their movement, and you're
Yeah.
saying only this is the right way to move. Again, using the performance bonuses, performance quote unquote, and incentivizing people through capitalist stick and carrot because there's also a stick aspect where if you don't do things right you get penalized, and there's a lot of articles and investigations about one doing the same practices as the UFC.
Hmm.
So then you alter the style where it's not even organically changing, but it's changing because you are forcing it to change to be more knockout inducive, um,
Hmm.
more favorable and more pleasing to what they believe is the Western gaze, right? Which
Which is the
is them,
bloodthirsty. Yeah.
yeah,
You
just
want to see
bleed kind of
damage and
audience. Yeah, yeah.
humiliation and domination. I mean, the
Which
way
is attractive to individualist societies where it's like we're not communitarian, so I want to see the other people other than myself getting brutalized like that.
And I think you talked about like on your Twitter probably like the racism of like they always call like really good fighters like this guy's a beast, this guy's a savage, he's such a savage, he's such a beast. And then if someone's really good at grappling or whatever, it's like oh he dominates his opponents. It was a dominant performance. And it's just interesting like those that choice of words and like for me it's like the idea of having a skill that you just can get so good at and like what the human body can do and like the strategy, all of that is really appealing to me. But like whenever I hear talk about like domination or like being a beast or a savage, I'm like, oh come on, like really, like I don't want to
That
be a
also
beast.
affects your view of the fight because you listen to that and then you think one person won, and then you
Yeah.
watch it again with the sound
Yeah.
off, right? And then it's because you're trying to process what they're saying, and a lot of times red flags go off in your head where you're like, what? That's
Hmm.
messed up. That's messed up. And then you're not even really watching it, and then you're like, how did this guy win?
Yeah.
But then you watch it again without the sound, you're like, oh, that makes a lot more sense. Like, yes,
So
there are bad judges, but the commentators are way worse than the judges.
yeah, the commentators, bad commentators
Yeah.
who also think the judges are bad. So, okay. So, like that. So, wait, one last question before we get into your approach, because it sounds almost like you're talking about something closer to dance, like break dance or, hip hop or like this kind of fusion of human movement
Informal.
that's creative.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
then where does the sport or the game or the rules actually facilitate learning or
Okay.
creativity as
Yeah.
opposed to limiting it or
hmm So we're talking about like I think we're talking about liberation martial arts, and that's why I call it an approach. It's not itself a martial art.
hmm
Um, it's can be applied to you learning any martial art, or you could just do it and see what organically comes out of it. And if you're so long as you're having fun, that's
hmm
great because a lot of people who participate in it or who are interested in it are, a alternative community who don't feel welcome or don't want to go to commercial spaces anyway. So then they're
hmm
not locked down by like I have to learn this because I'm going to go compete in this or that because they're never going to go compete anyway. So
hmm
then they just need to maintain a practice, right? So
hmm
then what's most important for them to engage and be um, consistent is it has to be fun.
hmm
So
hmm
there's a lot of different. So an approach affords all of that from very open ended, and you could move under rule sets you and your friends come up with versus like you want to do Brazilian Jiu Jitsu or you want to do Muay Thai, right? It's
hmm
open to all of that because it's just an approach to doing these things. Um, versus like even like training for self defense and fear, or they're extrinsic. You're doing it because somebody's forcing you to do it. It's not internally motivated, right? So that can get you in the door, but people who are motivated like that, that's not how you stay in the sport, or that's not how you stay in the practice. Because you look at all the people who've gone online and said leftists need to train some kind of self-defense or martial art,
hmm
almost none of them train themselves because
Right. It's
they're
not
trying to
fun.
use fear to motivate,
Yeah.
and that doesn't even work for themselves. So why would it work for others when it doesn't even work for themselves? You look at anybody who trains, including yourself. We never post about those reasons as
No.
reasons why you should train because we train because it's fun. If it's not fun, we're not going to do it. So
And
what gets
also
you in the door
like
and what gets you to stay are two different things.
I also feel very much like people who train know that it's not going to help you that much
Yeah.
in like in a military conflict it's not the best jujitsu player who's going to win like even
Yeah.
like urban fighting involves weapons and surprise and numbers and terrain and
So
who's yeah
this speaks to it, right? It's self-defense, even if that's what you want, right? And we could
yeah
unpack that because a lot of times they're thinking of like this urban other that's going to attack me. Even
yeah they're
radicals
thinking
think
of the
that. So,
crime like
yeah,
basically a
like
crime
unpack what you're thinking, dude. You're not as
yeah
radical as you think, right? So there's that problem with it. So they're already uh, accepting the reactionary framework as
yeah
basic fact. So that's already the first problem, right? But the other situation, the reality of it is what you're describing, which is that self-defense itself is an infinite matrix of options. Not
yeah
only is it contextual to you versus me, like how it'll happen to you versus me to another person is going to be
yeah
different. Sometimes organizers will, their source of violence is going to be like police
each other
or the
yeah
authorities, right? It's like,
yeah
will this work against? Are you going to like do an arm lock on a cop? Like, are you gonna do a Muay Thai? Like they think no, striking will be better than grappling, and it's like, okay, you're gonna Muay Thai clinch a cop. Like, what?
yeah
How are you thinking this is gonna play out, right?
yeah and
So,
like I was thinking like if a cop was mounting me
yeah,
in terms of jujitsu mount and I knew exactly how to escape
yeah,
I don't think I would escape
yeah,
because what's that gonna get me it's
killed.
gonna like contextually it might be like okay well it sure is nice to know that I could have escaped but like it's resisting arrest it's
So,
gonna
so that
yeah
defaults to then who can you use it for? The urban other.
criminal
Yeah,
yeah
yeah. So this is very problematic, right? People just don't unpack that. But despite that, even outside of that, it's an infinite matrix of options. It's unpredictable.
hmm
It'll never happen the same way twice.
that's
Everybody's
right
context will be different. Then does it even make sense to train a quote unquote self defense art or for self defense? Because those are the most prescriptive. The instructor, through their imagination, comes up with some scenario, and then you
hmm
rehearse that scenario. Right?
hmm
It's like pro wrestling,
yeah yeah
except it's worse than pro wrestling because pro wrestling realize is scripted, right? And that's different from
Yeah.
reality. Whereas these people are doing something, a scripted movement in a scenario, thinking that's going to be reality, when it's like trying to pinpoint where a bullet will go. It's like,
Yeah.
no, it could go all these other places. So then what's
Yeah.
the best approach to that? Even if you're interested in self-defense, you have to train in a way, in an approach that's very dynamic and
Hmm.
unpredictable, where you're able to like develop composure and most
Hmm.
importantly perception, like being able to perceive
Hmm.
what is the actual situation that I'm in. So then
Hmm.
before you make a knee-jerk
Hmm.
decision, you inform that decision, right? So the best way then is not scripted scenarios, but to practice in a way that's like a game. Whereas what is a game? It's unpredictable and dynamic, right?
Yeah.
Because it's open ended to an infinite uh, uh, matrix of options. What is self
Right.
defense? An infinite matrix of options. So even if you're like, oh, that's sport, that's not for self defense, your version of self defense is prescriptive and simulated and scripted. What you
Yeah.
really need is to be quick witted and to be clear with your thinking and your perception and to be able to adapt quickly. That is not going to teach you to be adaptive. Training in a way that teaches you to be adaptive is how to be adaptive, right? So
Right. But
even
I
if you train for
suppose that
fun, it's
I
better for self
suppose that
defense.
if you're dealing with someone who wrestles,
Yeah.
they will impose their prescriptive training on you if you don't have the preparation or you've never seen it before. I mean, that's basically how the early UFCs went.
Yeah.
The BJJ people had no knew what karate people were going to do and boxers were going to do and wrestlers were going
Yeah.
to do. The wrestlers and boxers didn't know what the jiu-jitsu people
Okay.
were going to do.
Okay.
And, and so there's I guess like that's my question to you. If everything is open and um unpredictable, there are like there are there are patterns of movement that are efficient. There
Hmm.
are patterns of, that, and you don't
Yeah.
necessarily need to discover them all the first time.
Hmm.
So like, you know, you had a post on the MMA rush,
Yeah.
right? So that's like that's
And I
something
explained
that,
how it came out of the material conditions, right?
yeah,
And why you
exactly.
don't see it in these other things, right?
But
So
you
then it
could,
wasn't prescribed. It wasn't even taught for these people who first did it. They
yeah,
just saw the opportunity and then they took it and then they started doing it and that's how it developed. So it wasn't, it emerged from the conditions.
sure. But imagine being someone who's seen it before
Yeah.
versus somebody who's never seen it before.
Yeah.
The person who's seen it before will be like, ah, okay, here comes the MMA rush. I can
Yeah.
counter it,
Yeah.
right?
Well, how do you, so there's also an assumption, right? There's a lot of assumptions.
Yeah.
So there's also assumption that you have about seeing. And we're
Yes.
not seeing, it sounds funny, but we're not seeing eye to eye on that. So
Okay.
you as the audience member see something, right?
Yeah.
But that's the third person perspective. So when I
Mm-hmm.
talk about
Hmm.
perception, I'm talking about first person perception. So
Mm-hmm.
we watch it like it's some kind of 2D
Mm-hmm.
side scrolling video game. So
Yeah.
we're like, why don't they keep their hands
Sure.
up? Why don't they see that, right? But
Yeah.
if it's like first person, I don't see
Yeah.
my hands. So
Yeah.
I don't know that they're not up. You
Yeah.
from a third person
Yeah.
perspective can see that. My perspective
Absolutely.
of it is like a first person shooter, right? So
Absolutely.
people from when you watch it as an audience, you look at somebody who's like dancing around a lot and um, you think that's elusive, right? So let's say I'm far away from you, right? Because they
Mm-hmm.
like to stand far away, and you're like, okay, from your third person perspective, that looks elusive. Let me demonstrate. I'm over here, and I'm
Yeah. Yeah.
like this, right?
Yeah.
Imagine that, except like I'm using my feet, right? And
Yeah.
so to the audience, seeing two people like side scrolling and they're like doing this,
Yeah.
that's elusive, right? But that's the third person perspective. First person perspective is I'm this close to you, right?
Yeah.
And then from your first person perspective, when I'm this close and snug, and then they do this,
Yeah. Yeah. You're
I
totally out of,
disappear.
yeah.
So what looks elusive to the third person is not what looks elusive to the first person, right? So they're different,
Yeah.
right? People don't realize that. So they model how they see, again, projected to the fighter. So when you say see, it doesn't matter if you see that rush as a viewer a bunch of times. The way it looks to you as a first person looks completely different. So unless you've had experience with that, this I'm going to connect this back to what you just said about the Gracies
Yes.
and like grappling. So I disagree with the framework that they got to. Well, I guess I kind of agree, but for different reasons. Meaning, when they fought those different arts, grappling at the time, they just sparred way
Hmm.
more
Yeah.
than those other people. So again,
Yeah.
they just did the dynamic game thing. And then
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
did that against those people. Those people did those prescriptive. So it's
Yeah.
opposite of kind of what you might have,
Yeah.
unconsciously suggested. Those
Yeah.
people weren't doing these like, oh, they're being unpredictable, dynamic, and they weren't prepared for this. Like, no, they were doing something very prescriptive, just
Right.
drilling, katas, and whatever. And then later on, when they're like the right kind of black belt or whatever, they started doing like sparring or whatever. But it was still
Right.
very, very constrained, not open ended. So what I'm
Yeah.
saying is, it came to those the observations you're making are correct, but it's actually happened because at the time grappling came from a more open ended world, and those
Right.
people came from a very constrained closed world. Now that's changed in grappling too, because now you got to get to a certain point to even like be allowed to grapple. Ever since
Hmm.
Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours
Hmm.
bullshit book,
Oh
drilling
my God.
became. Look, I've been training since the 90s, so I
Yeah.
could tell you how differently it looked then, ap- then and then after that book came out,
Oh
right?
no, really? It did that much
Yes,
damage.
it was mostly just sparring. It was
Yeah.
mostly sparring. And then when that book came out and people were like, this is where the podcast came in. I'm listening to a lot of podcasts about business and mindset
Yeah.
and brains. And I'm listening to this guy, Gladwell, and whatever. And you got to drill, man. You got to drill 10,000 hours to get good. And that's when it all became popular. Actually, a lot of that is credit to this sexual predator and
Yeah.
cult leader named Lloyd Irvin. He was the
Right.
first person to start drilling. Then everybody started adopting that, right? So even like the
Hmm.
origins of that in jujitsu is very
Well,
ugly.
Gladwell's also a Epstein uh
There
plane,
you go.
yeah,
There you go.
manifest.
So it changed a lot, right? So then it became this prescriptive thing. But now it's swinging around, right? A lot of people who were drilling are
Yeah, they
now
call it
losing to
the
people.
ecological approach. You've
There you
probably
go.
heard of.
See, so now they're going back to
Hmm.
grappling a lot again, right? Because the problem with the people who grappled a lot back then wasn't the fact that they were grappling a lot. It was that they were only training 3 times a week. You could be world champion back then,
Hmm.
training 3 times a week at night, once a day, because the landscape was like nobody. You were going against people who also did that, or people who never trained. You're fighting some karate guy who's never done grappling, right? But
Hmm.
now, it's like an arms race because everybody trains,
Hmm.
and you're only going against people who've also trained. Everybody has to up their hours of training. So now it's very common to train 2, 3 times a day, 7 days a week.
To take steroids.
Why? So that they could train more, right? It's not just
Yeah.
the strength, it's the ability to
Yeah.
train more. So then what is it? Oh, again, back to what is it? What is the secret sauce? The secret sauce isn't even a secret. You just roll a lot, you just spar a lot, and you get good. And that's
Hmm.
never changed. So it
So,
is always
okay.
open ended.
Yeah, I see. I see. You've convinced me. So, how do you do it?
So then if it's all about rolling, right? Then how do we, and even, okay, so let me backtrack, right? Because a lot of times there are different projects that are self-directed. There's a bunch of self-directed schools,
Hmm.
self-directed learning things. Even like a lot of the chuds are doing like the ecological grappling, but instead of being liberatory, it's very libertarian.
Hmm.
And what I mean by
Yeah,
that is
that's a
because
good
when it doesn't
distinction.
have a political philosophy behind it, it
Hmm.
just defaults to libertarianism. So like, these private schools, these preschools who are like, we do this self-directed, play-based, blah, 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 blah. And then you
Hmm.
go there and it's like anarcho-capitalism. Like nobody
Yeah,
shares
absolutely.
anything or whatever, because there is no political philosophical underpinning. They're like, no, no, we're not trying to have a political lean at all. And that just like
Yeah,
defaults
yeah,
to libertarianism because it defaults to whatever's the standard in the US and whatever's the standard for the teachers, right? And
exactly.
especially for jujitsu. I never even heard of the term libertarianism or have seen that don't tread on me flag until I walked into a jujitsu gym. That was like my first introduction. And for a lot of
Really, eh?
people at a certain time, that was also their introduction, especially in the 90s, 2000s.
Yeah.
Libertarians were very attracted to jiu-jitsu. Again, going back to being next to cop bases, military
Well,
base,
I
stuff like
thought,
that.
yeah, I thought that I mean, my first encounter with the word libertarian was Chomsky calling himself a libertarian socialist. And I was like,
Yeah,
well, and then I discovered most libertarians are not socialist
yeah.
whatsoever. Um, but like, yeah, I encountered a lot of libertarian politics in Jeet Kune Do actually.
There you go.
And I kind of attributed it to like the idea of like individual personal power. And
Yeah.
like that's what like Danaher says that too, right? Danaher says jujitsu is another thing. Like movies, you're where you are, Tinseltown, and like the idea of all movies are comic book movies now, and like all movies are superhero movies, and
Power
martial
fantasies.
martial arts is a superpower,
It's
right?
a power fantasy, right? It plays into this libertarian suburban power fantasy. And also
Yeah.
going back to, I was mentioning suburbans, right? It assumes like in the past, we assumed everybody was suburban who had like suburban paranoia.
Hmm.
There's also a filtering mechanism. The only people who can afford training are also
Oh
suburbanites
yeah,
who
I mean
carry with them
it's
that
so
paranoia, right?
expensive. Yeah,
Yes,
it's so
yes, yes.
expensive.
So, um, before we even get to the games and the live play, it has to have a philosophical underpinning, right?
Hmm.
But that's not just for the sake of having that. It also informs how to even design the thing well.
Yeah.
That's
Mhm.
for that's compassionate and like um, that's humanist, right? And not in a
Yeah.
Western way, but in a way that speaks to the human spirit. So before a lot of what we do at the beginning is creating ease. So I call it ease, but it's creating composure,
Hmm.
reducing, de-escalating yourself,
Hmm.
reducing anxiety, all the, because if you're
Hmm.
anxious, you're stressed out, you're nervous, what I call the startle response. If you're startled, you cannot
Yeah.
learn because your
Yeah.
brain is already occupying too much energy for something else. So then
Yeah.
you're not even in a place to learn, right? So even if you're rolling a lot, sparring a lot, you might not be learning because if you're in a high
Hmm.
anxiety state, you're not
Hmm.
learning, right? If you're in a startle response, you're not learning.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of that. And then going back to perception, we do a lot of training on your eyes. We train the
Hmm.
eyes a lot, even giving like uh, the eyes like our gaze a direction. So oftentimes we'll look at the chest, for instance, right?
Hmm.
So like if I'm trying to, let's say, block punches, why aren't I looking at the hands? It's like the same reason why, if you didn't know, like a juggler doesn't look at the ball. You look at the ball,
Hmm.
you drop the
Yeah.
ball. You look
Yeah.
at the fist, you get hit,
Yeah.
right? If I want to draw a really good landscape, I look at the horizon and I just kind of squint and soften my gaze and just look at the colors and the shapes.
Hmm.
So if I just look at you and look at the torso, everything's attached to the torso. I'm just kind of like not really looking at anything, but using my peripheral vision. I
Yeah.
see everything, right? So we start with the gaze and
Hmm.
creating ease, de-escalating yourself. Because going back to how our vision works, right? Um, if I'm far away and you're, let's say you're like think of like a camera, right? If I'm just zoomed out and you're far away, it doesn't matter how much you move. I just see you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas if I zoom in and look at you really close, then I have to try to track you with my eyes all over, right?
Yeah.
But if I
Yeah.
just
Like
look at a
a
center
bird
point,
watcher.
yeah.
A
But if I
bird
look at a
watcher, you
center
don't
point,
look, you don't find the bird with the binoculars. You find the bird with your eyes, and then you get the binoculars once you already know where the bird is.
exactly. So the same thing, you have to learn to just soften your gaze. Because what happens when you're also startled? Your eyes start going all over the place. So it's actually
Hmm.
connected back to trying to reduce the startle response, trying to maintain ease in your movement, and then ease in your body, right? So a lot of those things. Why? Executive control so that you could actually learn and be in charge of your own decisions instead of like just having it happen because of like some survival instinct.
Hmm.
And so that, again, so you can learn, but also you're conserving energy because your mind and your body is using the same energy source.
Hmm.
So if all that energy is going to your mind because of anxiety and all this stuff, your body has less energy. If the way you move
Yeah.
is like taxing a lot of energy, you have less energy to even compose yourself, right?
Yeah.
They're at odds. But if you can move in a way that reduces energy and keep yourself at ease, then it's easier to maintain your ease because you have a surplus of energy, right? So in LMA, when we talk about flow, we don't talk about the flow state like a psychological state. We talk about flow as a way of moving, as an action, not a state, right? Things we do, not things we identify with, right? So
Hmm.
again, going back to martial arts, it's all about what you do, your actions, rather than like your self belief about yourself. Because then that goes back to like you're in your head, you're thinking about yourself, right? Don't think
Yeah.
about yourself. Be centered on your partner, be centered on your information landscape, right? If I'm talking to you, I can't be checked out thinking about myself and having some internal monologue. Then I'm checked out. Then I'm not
Yeah.
really here, right? We're together, but I'm like in an isolation tank watching a movie in my head, and I'm
And
not paying
and
attention to you.
in your pedagogy, it also sounds like the training partner is not somebody to beat, to dominate, and compete against even, but like somebody who's actually helping you. How do you like understand the social aspect of
Yeah.
training?
So that's why we don't say opponent. We
Yeah.
think of it, we're partners, right? So they're
Hmm.
your guides. So let's say it takes a while to work people up to this, but if we're just sticking with kickboxing, let's say before we hit work on like even getting hit to the head, we're just hitting to the torso at the beginning, right? So let's say they hit your shoulder.
Hmm.
You could try to resist it and then not learn what they're trying to teach you, or you're like, no, no, the path to most pain is to make a head-on collision. They're hitting me here. I go there, try to
Hmm.
resist. That's going to be the biggest impact. But
Hmm.
if I understand they're my guide,
Hmm.
if they hit me here, they're telling me the way to reduce that tension is to turn with
They're
it,
trying
right?
to move your shoulder. Yeah.
So I hope, but my survival instinct is to go this way.
Hmm.
But if I learn to just release and see them as my guide, I go that way. Then what do they call that in boxing, right? You're rolling with the punches. Same thing. If they hit me here, if I try to resist it, I get knocked out. But if I roll with it and turn the way they want me to go, if I just go the way they want me to go, I'm going to get less hurt, right? So that is like the essence of defense. So we don't even start with hitting. We start with pushing. We push each other so that it's more of a, if I just touch you once, you didn't get information for long enough to even know which direction to go, right?
Hmm.
But if I just push you consistently, then that's more guiding my movement. So a lot of how we learn how to roll with shots is that we learn to roll with shots before we even learn to block or
Hmm.
dodge. We just have to get used to getting touched. Why? Because we have to get just used to
Composure. Yeah.
composure. So we don't start with that last. We start with that first. Let's
Hmm.
go to like grappling. We start from the feet up. So, what's the easiest way to get hurt by a takedown? I resist the takedown,
Hmm.
right? We don't even do break falls at all. We just go right to person, grab each other in a gentle way, and then try to guide them to the ground. Like here, a way to take them down, whether it's like a sweep or like a double leg.
Hmm.
If you go the way they want you to go, they don't care how you get there, right? Even if in competition, they don't, it doesn't have to be a
Yeah.
a very explosive slam.
Ballistic throw.
If you
Yeah.
just go to the ground, that's all they wanted anyway. So if you go with that, right, then you'll be safe. Especially when you're standing upright. The sweep has like the biggest fall. Then it has a bigger uh, 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 high to low fall than a
Hmm.
double leg, right? So that's probably the scariest. So just let them guide you down. And if
Hmm.
you actually, even like the person who's really trying to throw you down, but they're pushing you in a way that's actually gentle. Because they're pushing your head down, they're lifting
Hmm.
your leg up and kicking your leg out. They're turning you
Yeah.
into a ball. So if you
Yeah.
actually go with it, you'll just they're turning your body into the ball to the way you're supposed to roll through with it, right? And somersault,
Right.
right? If you don't resist
Yeah.
it, you will somersault, right? So
Yeah.
that's how we start. Just go with it, and then you realize, oh, this whole fear of whatever was like me resisting, right? And then once you
Yeah.
learn how to go with it, right? We take this from pro wrestling. There's this, and then stunts too. The safest way is to bump yourself. When they're trying to
Mm.
do something, don't let them do it to you. Just bump yourself,
Yeah.
right? The actor doesn't know what the hell he's doing with a throw. Just throw yourself, bump yourself, right? So they're
Hmm.
guiding you. They're telling you how you should shape your body. Just
Yeah.
and then just bump yourself. Just dump yourself. If we're using Muay Thai terms, dump yourself. Once they start doing that, they create a comfort with the ground, right? They
Hmm.
have a different relationship with the ground, with the land, right? They no
Yeah.
longer fear it.
Yeah.
Once you don't have a fear it, then if they don't want to go to the ground, they're so much better at not going to the ground. But
Yeah.
if they are scared, they're so stiff, right? If you're like a loose tree, you don't go to the ground. If you're like a stiff board, it's so easy to knock you down,
Yeah.
right? Because only one part of you has to go and the rest of you goes,
Hmm.
right? Like the analogy I use is like a sapling in a wind versus like a very old tree that's very stiff and dehydrated in a tree. The old tree falls. The sapling will just sway in the wind, right?
Hmm.
So if you can relax, right, and somebody
Yeah.
grabs your leg, you don't go to the ground. You look at, MMA and whatever, somebody grabs your leg and they're so relaxed because they're limp legging their leg out. If
Yeah.
you're stiff, the moment they don't even have to try to take you down. The moment they grab your leg, you just fall over
Yeah.
like a board, right? So once you have that comfort, all of a sudden you're already harder to take down anyway. So it's not even like it's training you to go to the ground. It gives you the comfort so that you don't even have to go to the ground if you don't want to. And you're less likely to get hurt because when you're soft and relaxed, none of your joints are locked out. When you're scared and stiff, your joints are locked out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your knees are locked out. So when people are scared and resist and stiff, that's when I've seen all the knee injuries during takedown. But if you're
Yeah.
supple, your knees already have slack. You're kind of like bent anyway. So even if
Mm-hmm.
things go wrong, there was enough slack for your knee where it doesn't like what
Mm-hmm.
is called shear force. It just goes with it because they already had slack. It had room to go. So even with grappling, we start like that. We don't even why the break fall idea is kind of interesting because well, how do you do it? You do it by yourself. But when you're
Mm-hmm.
doing judo or grappling, you're never going to fall by yourself. The person is throwing you, and oftentimes they're falling on you. So the mechanics or way the
Yeah,
way it happens when somebody falls with you is completely different
totally
than a
different.
break fall, right? So break fall, they're like, yeah, it saved me when I fell in the ice. Yeah, that is what that's
Because you were
for,
falling by
probably, right?
yourself. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
but when
probably
you're
didn't
grappling, and
probably
also
didn't
when they're trying to take
yeah.
you down, I could grab onto them, and we become one shared object, so
Yeah.
they can take a lot of the impact too, right?
Well,
If somebody's
yeah, I
double legging
find
you,
that in
you hug
judo,
them,
like, yeah, judo, like
you reduce
you
that.
train ukemi hundreds and hundreds of times. You train ichikomi, and then like randori is just totally different. It's
Yeah,
just nothing that I did helps me.
yeah,
It's like this, it's a game, it's a grip game, and they're doing things that I never learned. Like they taught me a throw, like grab here, and throw. Grab here, and get thrown.
yeah,
But then, like when you're actually playing, they're grabbing you here, they're grabbing you there, they're switching grips, they're doing this, and then you're on the ground.
yeah.
And
So
so,
compare somebody from LMA, right? Let's speak the same language of grappling.
yeah,
You've done grappling, let's say, not you as in you, but like a hypothetical, you did grappling for a year. 90% of that was spent just drilling and doing all these
yeah,
other things, right?
yeah,
And you just train 5 days a week, days a week. Let's say this other person who's doing LMA has only trained for 30 days, but all they
hmm,
did was the grappling part. And
yeah,
secondly, they were so composed, 100% of it downloaded, right? They
yeah,
consolidated that information.
yeah,
It would be hard for me to guesstimate if those two rolled and they were evenly matched in all the other ways like size, age,
hmm,
strength, who would win? Not that we care so much about winning in LMA, but
yeah.
I
Probably the
sometimes
one who's
gamble.
played more. Yeah,
Yeah, I would probably give that on my guy,
yeah, for
right?
sure.
And I'm not dealing with I'm working with a community who are mostly radicals organizers. So it's not even like the chuds who go in wanting to do that violence. A lot of my
Hmm,
time then is spent on trying to de-escalate a lot of that trauma, PTSD, and
hmm.
whatever. So I can't even like start them right away, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean the other experience in jujitsu for me, even though I had some, some background in other martial arts, was like the first 6 months, somebody's just on top of you, choking you,
Yeah,
breaking your arm, and like you have no prospect of getting out of anything of, even learning. You're just getting smashed for your first.
exactly. You're not consolidating information. It's just in
No.
that time reinforcing your survival
Yeah.
instincts.
Yeah. It's just, but yeah, and it's just this feeling of total dread. Like, I,
It's not fun.
yeah, it's not fun. It's
Yeah,
and there's like always guys at the. It's funny because like you were talking about like the suburban other, right? Like the
yeah,
person who's out there just to hurt you. Like
yeah,
those are the guys in your gym.
yeah.
Those are the guy. Like there's a guy in your gym that wants to hurt you specifically because like
Because they want to pretend you're that guy
yeah.
that they're
And
going to kill
so
on the
like
street.
there's like someone at the gym and they always want to roll with me and it's like, oh, this guy's gonna try to hurt me. And it's like, the etiquette is you can't say no. So, you're rolling with this guy who's trying to like mess you up. And it's just like, how did
And
I
think
end
about how
up in
messed
this?
up that is. You can't even say no,
Yeah.
right? So it's like
Yeah, exactly.
anti-consent. So it's
Yeah.
like the way I think about violence is about consent. And so then you're taking something that's
Yeah.
supposed to be consensual because you're supposed to always slap hands and agree to roll. But
Yeah.
then that's just symbolic, right? It doesn't mean anything
Yeah.
because you're not supposed to say no,
You're not supposed
right?
to. Yeah.
So
There's
then, of
some,
course, you can have violence enacted on you in martial arts studios and gyms because
yeah.
a lot of times it's consent under duress anyway.
Yeah. The consent is basically like you're consenting because you came to the
Yeah,
class.
yeah.
So, like, if somebody asks you to roll, you pretty much
because you could get
Right.
ostracized. Like in the locker room, people start talking smack
Yeah.
about you, right? And then it's like, oh, don't roll with that guy, man.
Yeah.
They'll start, uh, that's when like the toxic masculinity comes in, and he's
Yeah.
like, like all these types of like pejoratives about your masculinity and whatever, and that all
Yeah.
starts. And then,
Yeah.
but then how it ultimately materially affects you is even if you don't care about that, you just can't train enough. Nobody wants to train with you, so you can't get better either.
Well, yeah. Or like training with you means just like inflicting pain on you, or like
Which
you're
also you
just,
don't get better.
yeah, you're just living under somebody's, side control or,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
So, so you, what, so you do it in this way. Where do you do it and how do you do it? And like, how do people find you and your work? And like, do you have a
Okay.
gym?
Yes, it's in Los Angeles. We call it the LMA Learning Lab. It's very small. It's very, very small. So it's mostly just like one-on-one or like maybe just a handful of people.
Hmm.
But before we even started doing that, it all started online first. So it's an
Okay.
online curriculum first. And then I decided, let's start doing it in person. A lot of it was I didn't feel comfortable for a long time because of COVID and such. So I
Hmm.
didn't do it for a while. And then I started doing it in person and doing it in person and experimenting with this, right? It was all existed in theory for a long time. I got to do more of it in practice and a lot of it worked better than I thought. And then I learned a lot. So then I'm constantly updating the curriculum based on like constant play. I'm playing with my research, right? They
Hmm.
sometimes call this pracademia, where you're a
Hmm.
practitioner practicing your academic subject, right? I'm not
Yeah.
an actual academic, but I have an independent like research project, which is
Yeah.
this project. So, which I'm also trying to get grants for research. But um, yeah, so I got to practice it and then update the curriculum. So it's a loop, right? The
Yeah.
online thing exists as the theory. I practice it, which informs the theory, and it's just this loop. And so it's never going to be done. It's just constantly going to be evolving. And then, but it's still useful from day one. So people who are doing it, they could apply it right away. And then they evolve, we evolve. I learn from them. Like the juggling example I got from a practitioner in the UK, because I do a lot of remote
Hmm.
sessions as well with training organizers and facilitators. So I don't say instructor or coach. I
Hmm.
usually say training organizer because the way you should think
Okay.
about running it is the way you should think about like yourself as a organizer of politics or an org. You just
Hmm.
organize it and then
Hmm.
let the people
Hmm.
self-direct and self-organize a lot of what they're going to do, right? You can't micromanage all of them and that's just not fun and it's also very like um that's the pedagogy they came from, micromanaging. Like you're a corrections officer. You're constantly correcting them, right?
Yeah.
Just let them
Yeah.
be.
I guess that's right. Yeah. It really is a police and a military and drill and
You don't
yeah.
think I think for you. You just drill the stuff I tell you to do, right? You're a
Yeah.
grunt. That's
Yeah.
why it's not just the culture. The pedagogy itself makes martial arts a pipeline for police and military, right? We
Hmm.
already know a lot of people who train, they become, it's not just cops and military come there. A lot of them also become cops and military, right?
Yeah.
Because they've already been conditioned for
Yeah. They
that in
know
the
the
martial arts practice.
discipline. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
So
and okay, so
online
what
is the
if you
best,
do?
most accessible for most people, and then in person for people in Los Angeles. But we have been having getting people come all the way to LA from wherever
Yeah,
just to train
right
with me.
on.
So that's been kind of cool.
Sports. What if you do want to do sports though? Is that like a
Yeah,
thing that people do? People from your gym go and do a tournament or
yeah.
whatever? Yeah.
So in the learning lab, um, again, going back to self-direction and organizing, right? My background, the thing I've trained the most is grappling, but
Hmm.
the people who were initially coming in, they weren't interested in that. They were interested in kickboxing, right? Or just some kind of striking art.
Hmm.
And then one of the practitioners wanted to do a Muay Thai competition, and I wanted to find something safe for him. So just after like a few months of training, we found a technical Muay Thai. So technical Muay Thai is like much more like amateur, good for like people who are just doing it for recreation. Basically, like you can't knock each other out,
Okay.
meaning you can, but they're telling you don't hit to try to
Yeah.
knock each other out.
Right.
To the head. Anywhere else in the body, yeah, kick as hard as you want, punch
So
to the
you can
body as
get
hard as you want.
those.
But the head,
You
I
can
think the
get those
organize,
leg kicks you remember for 2 weeks or whatever.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. Because I
yeah,
think because it's not licensed either, so the organizers also don't want to deal with like
right.
trouble with that because there was a technical Muay Thai tournament in Canada actually where somebody like got brain damage and
Mm.
became comatose. So that can still happen, right? So, but they're discouraging you from doing that. So we found a thing, and then we had. So once he wanted to compete, because it is so communal, they're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, so and so's doing. It. I want to try that too." And then everybody was like, "I want to compete in Muay Thai." And so, very much lately, it's because our learning lab practice has become about. I try to talk them out of it, to be honest, at the beginning. Like, why
Yeah,
you want to do?
I
Let's
don't
just
think
have
I'll
fun.
ever compete. You know what? Like when you go to a jiu-jitsu gym,
Yeah,
it's less so I found in judo, but in jiu-jitsu, it'll be like they'll teach you some move
yeah,
and they'll say, okay, look, like if right now, let's do it this way, don't do it fast, do it really slow and take care of your partner. I mean, in a tournament, obviously, like just do it fast and just rip his arm off or whatever. And I'm always like, so you're kind of telling me if the other coach in the other gym says that, then I'm going to be competing against somebody who's trying to rip my arm off.
yeah.
I don't really want to do that.
I've found that as I've aged, though, because I'm picking up striking later, and I've gotten pretty good too, just from the same approach. So I'm like a
Hmm.
testament to it as well. But it's much easier on the body, so long as you can manage the
Yeah.
head damage,
Yeah.
which we do really well. Which there is no head damage the way we do it. Um, because if people are composed and they're not startled,
Yeah.
then they can literally just tap you in the head
Hmm.
and then like hit you hard to the body if they wanted to. They have that
Yeah.
much control because they're there. They're not checked
Yeah.
out. If I'm
Yeah.
startled and I'm just thinking about survival, everything's
Yeah.
going to be hard. Not because I
Yeah.
even want to hit you hard, but I'm like startled, I'm scared, I'm anxious, right? So
Yeah.
we really manage that. Then once you can manage that, I get hurt so much less
Yeah.
in striking Muay Thai than I do grappling. Because why? Because the nature of the way you're going to get hurt is just on flesh. It's just
Yeah.
bruises.
Yeah.
Grappling, the way you get hurt is
Body weight.
bones and
Yeah.
joints,
Yeah.
right? Like you're lucky if it's just a bruise, but it's rarely a bruise. So, but we do some grappling. A lot of the in-person people are not interested in it.
Mm.
Um, but we do some grappling too, and even that, man, this system works even better for grappling because people get good fast. So, but yeah, we are competing. There's people who've competed after just training 20 days,
Right on.
and they've done really well. And you just see in the videos, like that's the other thing. We don't do belts or ranking. It's like, what's the
Yeah.
point of that? Is to know your progress. We have technology. Just document it. Record yourself. So that's
Yeah.
why we have so many videos. We're constantly recording yourself. That's how we track progress. And it's not even going to have to be for public consumption. You record it with your own camera, watch yourself, and
Absolutely.
then it becomes clear. So this goes also back to motivation and self-determination theory. One of the most
Hmm.
important things is that you have self-direction, that you could decide uh, how you move, what you're going to do. Another big part of self-determination theory, how you get motivated in something, is you have to see yourself progress. So that's why like martial arts works better even than like working out per se,
Yeah.
because working out is often just tracking how you look, which
Yeah.
in itself then is demotivating versus tracking your progress in a skill,
Yeah.
which can
Yeah.
actually infinitely improve because even if you lose athleticism, you can be skillful in other ways. You could be skillful in understanding things better. That could
Yeah.
keep going. And the other thing is that you actually are plastic until like very late in age. It's just that as you get later in age, you just don't want to ever use that plasticity anymore. So people just thought people weren't improving because that just came with age. But actually, your brain and your body can keep physically altering and improving. It's just
Hmm.
that the nature
You
of
stop.
like attitudes, and we could go back to like capitalism or whatever. You're like, I've paid my dues.
Paid your
I've
dues.
done hard stuff. I'm done. I don't need to work hard anymore. I don't need to learn this or that. I'm done learning, right? There's that attitude. So I think that becomes something we're conditioned in. And that's why we didn't even recognize until scientists, I mean, people don't even know scientists say you could be plastic until much later. So, yeah. Um, I find kickboxing is much easier on my body. Grappling is still fun, but and so whether we compete in grappling or not, here's the other thing, right? We could just go compete in Muay Thai, no problem. Grappling, going back to like hierarchies, and it's not even just a hierarchy; it's
Yeah.
cartels. Like unless I'm part
Associations.
of some of, I can't. I
Absolutely. Yeah.
literally cannot. So I'd have to call a friend, and be like, hey,
Hmm.
can I be part of your association?
Under your thing. Yeah.
Because they
Yeah.
won't let you unless you're part of some association. So it's run very much like this monopoly cartel where you have to
Hmm.
be in their approved thing. And that your instructor has to be a certain degree black belt,
That's right.
all these things. And these back when I started in the 90s, you could rank people starting at like purple belt. If you're a purple
Hmm.
belt, you can make a blue belt. If you're a brown belt, you can make a purple belt.
Purple. Yeah.
Yeah, and you only needed to be first degree to make another black belt. And that
Hmm.
all changed, right? So a lot of people think like this is legacy or whatever, and it's just you're just seeing false traditions and
Yeah.
myth making happening in real life. Like people are like with the
Absolutely.
belt whipping, oh, it always happened. It's like, no, dude, it started in California by this chud who was training near the military base, and he got it from the military people who
Right.
he was training. They were like, oh, you need some kind of hazing thing. It creates camaraderie. You know, that's where that guy Chris Howder got it from the military, and then he got exported to Brazil. It's so all those kind of things, they
Yeah.
weren't original. This isn't some ancient art. Taekwondo is not an ancient art. A lot of these arts are not ancient. A lot of the
Yeah.
ones that we're talking about, the military self-defense kind of arts, we think they're like traditional. I don't even like using that term because they're
Yeah.
not that old.
No.
Even
No,
belts
it's
isn't that
mostly
old.
19th century and it's like you said, colonial
Yeah,
or
it's very Japanese dominated, right? Even
yeah.
Brazil has its roots there,
Yeah.
right? So a lot of the way people think about martial arts is like these
It's
Japanese
basically a fusion
traditions.
between Japan and America,
Yeah,
ultimately. Like
yeah.
America, England, Japan, all the different, like lots of judo moves came from those wrestling traditions. Lots of wrestling came from that, from judo.
Western
Like,
military, U.S. military actually influenced a lot of how they train too. This whole like
yep.
lining up
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
military, just like the military, right?
Yeah.
You even
Karate
look
is
at like,
like lots of boxing in karate.
yeah. And then you even look at how they kick, right?
Yeah.
You look at South Asian martial arts that, and a lot of martial arts and movements that started on the dirt. For the most part, you didn't
Mhm.
pivot on the ground because
Yeah.
that would tear up your feet and then you could get
Yeah.
infection and that's bad,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But then who came up with those mats? The Japanese did with the tatami
Of
mats.
course. Yeah.
And also a lot of those kicks, people don't even know it came from Savat, who had those what I
Yes,
call privileged
exactly.
shoes, right?
French.
So it's all of, and then you look at like
Yeah.
what you think of non-European movement. It's a lot of stomping, like from folk dancing or whatever. Then they're
Yeah.
like, oh, from the Orientalist lens, you're like, that's barbaric. Whereas
Hmm.
from the dance to even like these martial movements, it's about like these twirling, these pirouettes, is very
Hmm.
European movement. So now you think about the way people just spin in a kick, and you're like,
On a
that couldn't
wood
have emerged from the dirt. That
on a
came from
wood
shoes,
floor. Yeah,
yeah,
a
and a wood
nice
floor, a
wood floor
tatami
with
mat,
just
right?
the right amount. Like I remember training yeah, it was like
Or military shoes, right? So what a lot of people
yeah.
think is authentic to their culture is nah,
Yeah, I was
it's
trying
not.
to do martial arts in this dance studio and it was like this floor was slippery.
Yeah.
And so you just realize like if you change the slipperiness of the floor by 10%, almost all your martial arts moves go out the window. And if you change the hardness of the floor by 10%, most of your jujitsu goes out the window.
Yeah.
So it's like, you're really a lot more dependent on the environment than you think.
So these movements emerge from these environments also.
Exactly. Yeah.
So then you look at these other arts, right? Why were they off balancing games? Because you didn't have these mats, right? Why
Hmm.
did they move in these like step? Why are they step oriented instead of spinning on the ball of your feet, right? Because they
Yeah.
had the dirt and they were barefoot most of the time, right?
Yeah.
So then the what we take as quote unquote martial arts mainstream, then you realize it came from like Europe and Japan, and that
Yeah.
influenced the movement. So going back to even off balancing games, these were not off balancing games because going back to slipperiness, right? A lot
Yeah.
of these games did not care, or a lot of these quote unquote martial arts did not care about if you were off balanced because it would just continue on the ground. If you're taekwondo, they don't count against you if you're like kicking and falling to the ground, right?
Yeah.
UFC doesn't care about that either, as long as you get back up, right? Like
Yeah.
jiu-jitsu, you could just flop on the ground, right? It
You
didn't
could
care
just
about the
sit.
off balancing aspect. So it's very counter also. It's about
Yeah.
cranking something and trying to hurt you, but it's
Yeah.
very counter to the off balancing stuff. So then, like, something that's changing in Muay Thai because of one, but and the changing of the gloves, they're oftentimes using MMA gloves. It's all about the knockout. But if you look at the way, even now, it's still done in the stadiums, it's still an off balancing game. Meaning, even though it strikes, Unlike
Hmm.
the way it's scored in boxing or whatever, it has to, there's so much
Mm.
about not getting wobbled, right? Like
Hmm.
if you get hit with a kick and you have to hop and rebalance yourself, right? In
That's a
MMA, that don't
point.
count against you, but that looks bad to you. If you get dumped
Hmm.
and fall to the ground, that looks bad, right? If
Hmm.
somebody grabs in the clinch, neither one of your knees, but I'm just shoving you around, that
Hmm.
the off balancing, that's the difference. It's not
Hmm.
about just it hitting you. It has to slightly off balance you. That's what makes Muay Thai, right? So it still stays grounded in this tradition of like not being off balance. That's changing now, right? Because it's becoming more about the damage. But
Yeah,
yeah, a lot of that then they didn't care about falling to the ground or being off balance because it's all matted up anyway. Or you're getting traction and friction from your shoes.
exactly.
So those conditions that came as part of hegemony, right, altered not just martial arts, these folk movements, but also our perception of martial arts. So a lot of what I do also is like cultural work. I'm deconstructing a lot of like what we take to
Yeah.
be as basic fact, which is not basic fact, right?
So you have to go back to the beginning and start fresh. And it sounds very fresh, Sam. I'm glad we got to talk about this today.
Well,
Is there
one
anything
thing,
else you wanted to add?
yeah, one thing that hasn't changed is why do you train? You train because you make friends
Hmm.
and it's fun. But then we project onto the past, like, no, 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 that's not why they used to train in the past. They trained for self-defense. Like, no, if you actually study it, they trained because of kinship building, community building, and it was fun. So
Yeah.
that was the same reason they trained. So instead of being ashamed of that, I think fun, people are ashamed of fun because they're like, no, 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 it's a serious thing. And it's like, no, 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 that was the authentic reason for a lot of cultures, a
Yeah.
lot of communal cultures. They trained because it was fun and you made friends. That is the point. So that still stayed. That's baked in. No matter how much they try to remove that,
Hmm.
that's not how they sell it to like get you in the door, but that's why people stay. So that
Yeah.
still has remained. So even though it's fresh and these ideas are new, they're actually still old. And a lot of these ideas resonate with people because they're like, yeah, 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 yeah. I never thought about it, but I train because it's fun and I make
Yeah.
friends, right? So that's stayed consistent, no matter how much they try to change that.
Cool, man. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's stop there.